Hey everyone, welcome to season 2 of Reversing Climate Change. We are doing that podcast thing now and launching a Patreon. You can find it at patreon.com/NoriPodcasts. There are various tiers with different types of goodies available. Do you want to receive a special newsletter digest of what Nori Knots are reading that week? Be a part of a Nori book club. Get special access to Nori events. Go take a look at patreon.com/NoriPodcast for what we're offering. And in that spirit of being lean in that startup kind of way that, we like to do, this list of goodies is subject to change, and we'd very much like your feedback. Is there something that you'd really like to see, but it isn't listed here? Honest feedback does a lot to help us shape what we offer to you. You can send an email to podcast@nori.com or fill out our podcast survey anonymously in our newsletter, which you can find at nori.com/subscribe. And thank you so much for listening to another season of Reversing Climate Change. Hello and welcome to Reversing Climate Change. I'm Ross Kenyon. Paul Gamble, CEO of Nori, and one of my fellow co-founders is here with me. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Ross.
Hello. We have the distinct pleasure of having Matthew Yglesias on today, co-founder of Vox, host of the podcast The Weeds, writer, journalist, and author of 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger. Hey, Matt.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for coming on the show. We're so happy to have you.
I'm really glad to be here.
Yes, indeed. Well, this book, we have thoughts about it. We care about this issue a lot. We think it's really important. We like that you tried to thread a very unique needle on it. And we were thinking that maybe the best way to get started is if you could run us through the basics of what you're trying to accomplish with it.
Okay, so the point of 1 billion Americans is that there should be 1 billion Americans. So you can say, why? Why 1 billion Americans? Yeah, basic reason, look, we have a world of sort of growing geopolitical competition with China in particular, to an extent, India coming up there too. It's because we finally have rapid population growth in some very large countries that have historically been quite poor. This is mostly good. It has reduced poverty around the world. It's something to celebrate. But the sort of dream of the 90s that economic growth in China would lead to liberalization and democratization and an embrace of a rule-based global order, that has totally not happened. And no American political leaders are saying, oh, that's fine, we'll just be number 2, let's submit to Chinese hegemony. But they're also now talk realistically about what you're going to do about it, right? So like Obama said, well, we need to win the future with, I don't know what, it was like some grant for people to get technical education at community college. But it's a fine idea. We should do that. But it's ridiculous compared to the scale of the problem. Trump was maybe going to ban TikTok, or then now maybe he won't. And, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. But taking on China's video meme apps is it's not going to get it done, So if we think about the fundamentals, it's China is about Mexico in terms of per capita living standards, maybe Bulgaria, depending on how you look at it. Better food than Bulgaria, though, so maybe closer to Mexico in that sense. But they're this huge, great power because there's 1.2 billion Chinese people. So I say, let's embrace, you look historically, right? The United States, really big deal in the world. Canada, nice country, not a big deal. Why? We're a big deal because we have 10 times their population. And we have 10 times their population because our leaders historically made it a priority to get people to move here. And so I think we should look going forward, we should support families with children. We should do more in terms of paid leave, in terms of preschool, in terms of child allowance, so that people can have 2 to 3 kids per family, which is what they say they want instead of 1 or 2, which is what they actually have right now. And we should be more open to immigration. And we should see this as the real American greatness agenda, is to grow the population. We're not obviously going to triple it overnight because it takes time to build houses and things, but we should aim for aggressive population growth rather than settling for stagnation and national decline. And that is the book. And this is usually when people start yelling at me about climate change. So,
oh yeah, I'm going to save that downstream just a little bit. I really like about this book that you state your assumptions and your values very close to up front in the book, which I find is weirdly uncommon. So I do admire that. But you chose to frame this book in geopolitical terms about world leadership and competition between countries, which I associate you and Vox as being a relatively progressive outfit. But that doesn't seem to be something that we think of. In fact, sometimes when I think of the left, I almost get the sense that they wouldn't mind if the United States gave up its world hegemon status. So I don't know. How's the big reaction been to this portion of it, and how did you land there?
Well, so if I can play psychiatrist, I think a lot of people on the left would be more comfortable with a world in which they themselves lived in a country that was more like Canada or New Zealand or Denmark, like a country that just doesn't have hegemonic aspirations. They're not comfortable with that aspect of the American national project, and so they don't like to talk about it. At the same time, when you kind of bear down, are there people in America who say, well, it would be better if China was hegemonic? Would it be better if we had a global military hegemon that cared even less about human rights than the United States, that was more autocratic, more racist? And like, no, right? Nobody actually thinks that. It's just also not something that progressive-minded people want to embrace. And, I had a professor a long time ago by the name of Glyn Morgan, and he wrote a really interesting book 15 years ago, and it's called The Idea of a European Superstate. And it was encouraging the European Union to become more integrated, much more integrated, and have like a single European military entity, and so there would be like EU aircraft carriers and an EU nuclear arsenal and European, like Euro Navy SEALs. And his whole argument, this is the Bush era, his argument was that like America, has become this like quasi-rogue state. And we can't count on the Americans anymore. So we need to do it for ourselves. And that's a super interesting argument. And if I were European, I think I would be doing takes all the time about how Professor Morgan had that right. But one way or another, like that's not what happened, right? We got Brexit. We've had a sort of loosening of the European common border strategy. And, so from the American perspective, it's like, you sort of got to take it or leave it, right? There isn't some other like nicer country that's going to come along and be hegemon. We're not going to have Iceland become the world's number one power. There's only two real contenders, and America is by far, I think, the better horse to bet on.
Okay. Already anticipating angry emails. We'll see what happens with that. Okay, we'll go into the position now where people are going to now start yelling about climate change. We'll play that role for you here.
Thank God.
Yeah. I'll step into the breach and do this for you. So a lot of people that we speak with, they tend to have very strong sympathies towards degrowth economics, about humans making a strategic retreat, you could even say, from growth, from a consumption, and living simpler lives. This is definitely more of a wizardly rather than profit approach. We develop technology. We invite people in, immigrants start businesses, they develop technology, we're all better off, and we develop new alternatives to polluting enterprises. Is that broadly your position?
Yes. I mean, I think there's a lot that can be said about degrowth. I tend not to spend that much of my time focusing on why it's wrong, because I think in the actual politics of the United States, like the big issue is that the American government is doing like barely anything to combat climate change, and we should in fact be doing a lot. But I think that what happens is that because, we have this tremendous gap between sort of culture and politics, right? So it feels to a lot of people that it's like, well, we've been talking about climate change for all these years, and we're not solving the problem. So obviously the problem is borderline unsolvable, and therefore we need degrowth somehow, and that will solve it. But like, the truth is that what we need to do, like, it's frustrating that we're not doing it, but it's like, we need to do the things that boring, sensible people have been saying we need to do for like a bajillion years. Like, we need to price pollution externalities, and we need to invest money in technologies. And like, it's super tedious. Like, people like want the answer to be more exciting than that, because the politics is hard, but it's just hard. And like, if we price externalities and invest in technology effectively, then we can have a prosperous, growing society that mitigates climate change in a responsible way. And if we don't do that stuff, like asking everyone to go live on a farm and compost or something, like wear thicker sweaters, it's like, That's not a real idea. It doesn't mean anything. Like the country of Vietnam is not going to stop industrializing because American environmentalists would like them to.
Right. One of the inevitable outcomes of larger scale climate change is mass migration from place to place. And we had Bryan Caplan on the show a while back to talk about his book, Open Borders. So if you want 2/3 of a billion more people living in America, I'm assuming you're going to have more immigrants. Where do you think you might differ from Kaplan's approach?
Well, so I mean, I agree with Bryan about a lot of things. He's an economist. I think his economic analysis of immigration is really, really good. I think he quotes me in his book and I quote him in my book. So on one level, like we're very similar. On the other hand, like Bryan is a hardcore anti-nationalist. So I think his vision of immigration is in part about sort of dissolving the American nation in a kind of important way. Whereas I see it the opposite way, that like I want to strengthen the American nation. I think that people moving here has been a source of national strength. I think that people are right to be skeptical of the idea of totally indiscriminately opening up the borders, but that like we should in fact be much more open to immigration, both to make the country, I mean, primarily because like it will make America a better, stronger, greater, whatever nation.
Right. Isn't the population leveling off a good thing in some people's eyes? Like, break that down, what you were just saying. Like, why would it make us stronger? And how does having children relate to that too?
Sure. I mean, I think the most basic way that it makes you stronger, right? It makes a stronger country is market size, right? The United States for a long time, for about 100 years, a little bit more, has been the world's number one economy. And we've been the world's number one economy for so long that we don't think about that or what it means, right? But a lot of privileges come with that. Like anyone, anywhere who invents anything wants to bring it to the American market. Right? It's just a fact because our market is so big. Secondarily, when our government wants to regulate things, if we want to say, okay, everyone has to use high efficiency dishwashers, companies will complain about that because they don't want to do it. But if we tell them they have to do it, they will go do it. Right?
Right.
New Zealand can't just order people to change their whole manufacturing process because they want you to. Nobody cares about the New Zealand market. They'll just walk away, right? So they've got a nice little country there with a lot of sheep and the occasional movie shoots there and a high standard of living. But in world terms, they have to take or leave the world as they find it. And it's been a world shaped by the United States, which is fairly benign as a world for sort of nice guy developed countries to live in. China is less of a nice guy, and they are growing. And you see, they have become already the world's number one market for movie tickets. And so there was a great report in PEN America that PEN America put out in August about the consequences of this. And it means that right now, Hollywood shapes their movies according to the demands of Chinese censors, right? The PRC movie censorship office serves the role of the EPA for like, we regulate dishwashers, they regulate the content of movies. And as they get bigger, they get more influence. So right now, they tell Disney, you can't have a Tibetan character in Doctor Strange. So they change it. So the Ancient One is no longer Tibetan. It's played by Tilda Swinton and, she has no determinate ethnicity. But as it keeps going, right, as they get bigger, do they start telling Disney, well, ABC News can't cover human rights in Tibet? Do they tell NBC Universal that, MSNBC, CNBC can't cover these kind of issues? And what do we say, right? These are profit-seeking companies. If that's what they got to do to get in the China market, like that's what they'll do. You see it with American technology companies, right? So Apple has this big song and dance about user privacy. But there's just a huge exception for phones sold in the China market. And if the China market gets bigger and bigger, and China starts telling them, look, to get access to the China market, you have to let the Chinese government snoop on everyone's data, not just for Chinese phones, but for phones sold all throughout Asia. Like, is Apple going to say no to that? This is, I think, the basic concern that you've got to have. A lot of countries get by just fine with being small, but that's because America has been the big country, right? And I think it's in our interest. It's in our interest to coordinate better with allies. I mean, there's a lot of like Council on Foreign Relations type stuff you could think about here that we're not doing. But basically, like, the fundamentals of national strength come down to population size times per capita GDP, right? So we all talk all the time about how to grow our GDP. We have some ideas, but it's hard. It's hard to grow as fast as a poor country that's catching up. But we can grow our population.
Matt, you kind of sound like a conservative here. What gives?
Very conservative. I'm super duper duper right wing in this book, except that my two ideas are that we should expand the welfare state to take more care of parents and children, and that we should be more open to immigrants. So those are super left wing ideas. Mm-hmm. So,
So everyone loves you.
I'm beloved by all. No, look, it's been interesting. So the reason that this is a good book to purchase and read, because that's the point of all this, is that so much shit that you can buy today, it's so tedious, So the bestseller list is 11 books about how Donald Trump is a maniac. And I think one book about how liberals are destroying the country. And everybody knows what those books say. You don't need to read them. You don't even need to have them on the shelf. Everybody knows you already think about Trump. It's boring. This is a book that, I got some very good reviews in some right-wing publications. I got some bad reviews in some left-wing ones. I got vice versa. I got libertarians who like it, libertarians who hate it, social conservatives who like it, social conservatives who hate it. And it's because it is actually an interesting book that is not just tedious regurgitation of the same talking points. So people of taste and distinction from all political persuasions love this book. And, knuckle dragging cretins from all around the spectrum think it's bad.
Oh, no. Ruthless. Yeah, most of the thinkers I come back to time and time again are those that I find it really, any issue that breaks neatly into what I can imagine the right will say and what I imagine the left will say, I know is just going to be a boring, played out thing we've been debating for decades, and I really don't want to play in it. And I love people like Wendell Berry or Dorothy Day that I find very surprising. I'm just ooh, I don't always agree, but this is, at least you're saying something new, and I respect that. And there's definitely a lot of that in this book. So if you like that, I'm going to pay you that compliment, Matt. You're also in that category of poking everyone in the eye and giving everyone a hug, too. Is that okay?
Yeah, I just it's a weird thing about being a politics writer like I am, which is that agents come after you every once in a while and they're like, oh, you should write a book. But so many of the books that I think people in my line of work write just end up being boring, and our takes are better consumed in short form. So I wanted to write a book that was interesting, so I wasn't writing one. And then I came up with this idea that I actually thought was interesting. I have a lot of ideas that I think are true and correct, but a 200 pages for me of Donald Trump seems like he doesn't know what he's doing. Or, wow, Republicans, they really like cutting taxes on rich people, but also they're kind of racist. It's who cares? Those are tweets. Those aren't books. I love Twitter. I love tweets. But this is a book. It's not that long of a book, but even a short book is it's kind of a lot of pages. So I wanted to make it interesting, to put forward a proposition that I think is correct, that we should have 1 billion Americans, that people have a lot of questions about. And then I try to actually go through it and be here's how we can change housing to accommodate them. Here's how we can change transportation policy to accommodate them. Here's what I think the eco-pessimists and dystopians get wrong. Here's what the cultural declinists get wrong. Here's what you ought to know about immigration economics. Here's what you ought to know about welfare state design. It's it's chock full of facts and figures and information. Brad Plumer is a climate writer at the Times. He paid me, I thought, a great compliment the other day. He said, separate from the argument, I learned a lot from this book, which is good because Brad's a super smart guy. He knows a lot, and it's good to write a book that people can learn from.
Okay, one of the things that I noticed in reading this book is how much it made me appreciate cities. So I've basically always been a city dweller, either suburban, exurban, actually in the heart of various cities. And all I can see now in spending time in cities is the squalor and the noise. And I find them to be very frustrating. And I've since moved a little bit farther out of the core of Seattle. So it's more quiet, and I'm more okay with living in the proximity of the city. But I spend so much time on this show, talking about Wendell Berry. He comes up basically every episode, and this sort of idealized rural existence. And I need someone to bring us back to the center of that, because I think I've overdone it. So convince me that cities are actually a really important and good thing.
Cities are great. The thing about rural living is that I don't know. I don't want to be too provocative here. No, I won't be mean about it. So, okay, you have cities, right? And in the cities, we would all starve to death if not for the farmers in the countryside. That's just a fact. We need those countryside people. At the same time, the people living in the countryside would all be dirt poor subsistence farmers, if not for cities and urban life. You can have an idealized vision of the countryside, but you can also you can look in a lot of Asian countries to this day and see people living in huts, doing backbreaking labor 10 hours a day in rice paddies, growth stunted because they have no protein. And that's the natural state of rural life, right? We elevate above that. The reason that life in rural America or rural Australia, Canada, France, wherever it might be, is actually pretty good is that we have technologies and wealth that come out of cities and ideas and things like that. And that's to say cities in world historical terms, like agglomerations of human beings, right? Now, in America, we also have a lot of very specific things about central city municipalities versus suburbs that are near them. But obviously, the suburbs exist as part of an urban fabric. And it's totally reasonable for some people to want to live over here and some people want to live over there. You want to find a neighborhood that sort of suits you. But the point is that the city has to exist for all of that to make sense.
So I basically agree with you on that. And I've always lived in cities and I tend to like cities. And whenever I think about the idea of moving to a more rural area, I get a little scared of missing out on different cultural things and being close to the amenities that I like. But one of the frustrations I have living in the city is how cities are governed. And, before we started recording this, you were starting to share an opinion about how the Los Angeles metro system is poorly run. And here in Seattle, we've committed to an over $50 billion light rail system that won't even be fully operational until almost the year 2040. And then meanwhile, compared to China, your foil in this book, who are able to build mass transit systems in a week and a half, what are we doing wrong? How do we improve that? What are the mechanics of making cities work better for their residents?
Yeah, there's a lot that we are doing wrong. The point I was making, when we were talking before is that I think progressive-minded people are aware that big cities in America are not perfectly governed. If you just kind of ask them, right? You'd be how's it going in Los Angeles? Is everything perfect? They'd be like, no, in fact, there are significant problems in Los Angeles. Not to knock it, but just every city is like that. And yet you can't say, oh, well, the problem here is Republicans, right? It's we are actually struggling to govern ourselves and achieve what it is we want to achieve. I think a lot of that comes down fundamentally to land use questions, right? So the LA Metro, I'm quite familiar with the saga on this. And it's really sad. They have spent an incredible amount of money building a subway system in Los Angeles. And, of course, it's not that big of a subway system relative to the size of the city. It's totally understandable that it hasn't been enough investment to transform LA into a true mass transit city. But it's a much more extensive transit system than a small European city would have. But it has almost no ridership because LA, for starters, they run trains very infrequently. And the trains don't run frequently, they say, because they can't afford to run them frequently. But that's because fare collection is so low, because the ridership is so low. And then the ridership is so low in part because they didn't change any of the land use. They didn't say, okay, you can build tall apartment buildings now near these train stations. And, Seattle, I don't know as well, but I was there last year and I was taking whatever the train is, in from the airport. And, you're sort of cruising south of downtown into what look like, reasonably built up areas. But you'll be right there by a station and it's parking lots, or one story, it's kind of like strip mall style retail. And it's not zone to say, okay, you're within a quarter-mile walk from this light rail station. You could just put up a big ass tower. And then you go into like really, really the center of the city. And there is like some part of town where they have allowed people to put up big ass towers. And there's a bunch of cranes there. And so that everyone in Seattle is like, oh my God, there's so much development here. And there is, in fact, more development in Seattle than there is in San Francisco, where there's like basically none. But still, a majority of the land not in the Seattle metro area, but in the city of Seattle itself, is zoned for single family detached houses. And, it's fine. People like single family detached houses. But when you make it illegal to build denser stuff, you get huge housing affordability problems. You don't have the density to support transit ridership. And so you have everybody kind of kicking around, and it's like, well, I want somebody else to take the light rail. Like not me. I want to keep driving my car, and I want parking everywhere. But that's not how cities work. Like if you look at cities, whether it's Paris or Berlin or Hong Kong or Singapore or New York, right, that like have substantial transit ridership, they have made themselves too dense for it to be convenient to drive and park your car somewhere.
Where do you fall on buses versus trains? Because like I used to have to commute to downtown Seattle, and the bus route that I took came every 15 to 30 minutes. And then going home was a total nightmare. And I just always kept finding myself thinking, like, if we would just reroute some of the $50 billion that we put into this train system that won't even be usable for 20 years into just more buses with more frequent service, would that improve it? Would ridership go up? What does the research say on that? What's better here?
So, it's not that like buses are good and trains are bad or something. I do think that what's true is that when you have a city at the scale of Seattle, say, probably the best thing to do is to look at your bus network and try to make it better. Right? That the sort of quality of the bus service is a limiting factor on ridership there. Investing in rail, I think, is really, really worthwhile. But the reason to do it would be to facilitate very dense development near the rail stops. And I guess like that's what I'm saying about LA, right? They kind of wanted to like take LA as it exists, then spend a lot of money. Like the voters of LA were willing to truly open their wallets to this goal. But what they wanted to do was get somebody else to ride the metro.
Yeah.
So that their life could be exactly the same, but with less traffic in it. And it doesn't work like that, right? Like the LA Metro is this great achievement, like they spent a lot of money on it. It's a lot of tunnels. It does in fact work. But the reason to do something like that would be to rezone to have big apartment buildings near the train stations. And then a lot of people would ride the train, but it would be a different kind of city after that, right? But it would be a better city after that. And that's what people should do. Like if they want to have like green growth and, Green New Deal and blah, 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 blah. Like the whole point of the New Deal was for things to be different after it was done than they were previously. A lot of progressive thought, it feels like people want progress without change. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And like you can't have that.
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying like in LA, the train system, that's the end in and of itself, but you're suggesting that like rail investment should be a means to an end, of which is increasing density so that more people can live and work affordably in cities.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. I
Makes
mean,
sense.
or there are some places in America that are so dense. Yeah, I'm sorry. You have bus routes that have such heavy ridership in a few places. There's like a couple routes in New York that are like this, maybe one in San Francisco, maybe one here in Washington, D.C., where I live, that just upgrading them to rail would be justified just in terms of the number of people who would do it. But in the typical American city, Los Angeles, Seattle, Houston, Dallas, you're looking at big cities. There's like a lot of demand to live in them. And the purpose of building a rail network should be to reshape the urban form so that you can achieve a higher level of, urbanicity, urbanicness. I don't know what the what the right verb is. But it's like people would live near the train stations, like that's what trains are for. The thing that they are good at is that the geometry of rail lines is that they move human beings more efficiently than roads do. But if you don't want that outcome, then there's no point. I mean, I think trains look nice, as do a lot of people, but like that's not a good reason to build them.
I used to live in LA and to take the train sometimes, the red line off of Vermont. And if I had to go downtown, I would do that, or go into the valley. It was fine. And it worked okay. I've heard LA described as the United States' first postmodern city without just a clear center, where there was various different types of centers depending on where you would want to go. It wasn't like downtown LA was where all commercial activity was concentrated. In fact, probably quite the opposite. So how do you build in an environment like that? Does that model really make sense for it in the same kind of way as it might with Manhattan?
Well, so I mean, I think it does, right? So you take LA, right? And if you just posit massive upzoning of all of the metro stations, right? Then that starts to create a thing where more people are living near those stations. Sometimes because they want to ride the train, but honestly, maybe they have no desire to ride the train. It's just that houses are really expensive everywhere in California. So if you build giant apartment buildings, like anywhere in Los Angeles, some people will live in them. So now all of a sudden you have a lot of people and they're living near metro stations. And now companies are thinking about where to locate office buildings. And commute patterns matter, right? But the metro network converges on downtown Los Angeles, just like things do in classic cities. So once you have a bunch of people who are living near metro stations, then if you put your office downtown, that becomes a convenient way for a lot of people to get to you. Whereas if you have it in, wherever else, Culver City, it's maybe not as good. So it becomes a reason to have a sort of more centralized kind of thing. I would also say that Americans sometimes think that like Los Angeles and New York are the only cities in the world. So if New York is very like centralized and then LA isn't, it's like, well, LA is super weird. But there's a lot of multi-centered cities in the world, right? Paris doesn't have a hyper-focused downtown. Berlin has sort of several distinct city centers because of the unique history that it's had over the years. So it's fairly normal for cities to be a little bit less. Like Manhattan is an island. Like New York is actually a little bit of the weird city more than LA is. But LA is it's built around freeways. But that's because like they built these freeways and then they built the city around it. Now they built all these rail lines and you have to let the city build around them.
Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of a different direction here, Matt. We listened to your podcast with Tyler Cowen. If you're listening and you haven't heard Conversations with Tyler, often quite a good way to spend your time listening to a podcast. It's a good show. But you had some interesting comment about how centralizing in order to decentralize. So I think I speak for Paul and I here. I think we both like subsidiarity. We want institutions to be as small and as local as it actually makes sense to with the scale. Obviously, if it just doesn't make sense for something to be small scale and it needs to be larger in order to function properly, I'm not ideological about it, or I try not to be at least. But do you think a more populous country would make federalism and this sort of 50 different states experimenting work better and actually make that a more functional way to govern?
Well, I think the book does not get into this.
I think you say it's a whole separate book or something like that.
Of detail. But like people should ask themselves why American federalism is so crappy. Because it's like a good idea. Right. I think you discuss a lot of different problems and people will reach the conclusion that federalism might be useful here. And federalism really should be useful. Right. But if you look at it empirically, what happens is that the dominant player in state politics is the state legislature. Even more so, Congress is more powerful than the presidency, but state politics are even more tilted to the legislature. That's in part because they don't have the national security arena, which is a huge part of the president's job. It's in part because the executive branch tends to be disaggregated. So you'll have a separately elected attorney general, often an insurance commissioner, a comptroller, or a treasurer, other things like that. So these hyper-empowered legislatures. And then you look at state legislative elections, and you see that people's voting behavior is an almost pure function of their approval of the president of the United States. You know what I mean? So like people vote Republican for state legislature in Louisiana because they like Donald Trump. And that has obviously nothing to do with how good a job the legislature is doing of making policy for Louisiana. And people for governor show a lot more creativity. So Louisiana and Kentucky have Democratic governors. Massachusetts and Maryland have Republican governors. And that's because there's specific things that were happening in the states. But the governors don't actually have a lot of authority in those states. The legislatures do. And then they're often very gerrymandered on top of that. So I think that's all pretty bad, right? And if we want to have a real politics of federalism, we need to have real state politics. And that means some mix of empowering the governor more relative to other officials, because you have real electoral competition there. And it means trying to differentiate the political party system. Like in Canada, you can have totally separate parties in your provinces than you have in national federal politics, so that people say, look, in my Quebec election, I vote based on Quebec issues. And then in my Canada election, I vote based on Canada issues. And we don't have any of that in America. And it makes federalism very, very weak as a sort of like effective strategy for addressing governance.
Yeah, I see your point there. One of my biggest bugaboos is I'm just not a fan of the 17th Amendment and the idea of changing the way that senators are elected to be popularly voted upon rather than by the state legislatures. But it sounds like you're arguing against putting more power in the hands of the legislatures. But I guess just in general, we've got this major increasingly partisan times that are happening, and that doesn't seem to be slowing down. So we basically have a federal government that doesn't work well at all. And if we triple the country's population, is that going to make things better or worse? How do we make the government more responsive to that many people?
Well, so I put the cart and the horse the other way around. My claim is that our politics has become dysfunctional because in the post-Cold War environment, we have stopped really having a politics that's about improving America. Mm-hmm. And we've instead got this politics that's about pitting Americans against each other and fighting with each other, right? Yep. And it's not that having a larger population will fix that problem. It's that raising our gaze away from picking fights with each other and toward thinking about America's role in the world and how we can be the dominant great power of the next century and the century after that will naturally create a more constructive politics. Because, so one thing in the book is I'm talking about how we should do more, to support people with daycare subsidies. And, I give my view of what's the right way to do that. But I could totally imagine a conservative person putting more weight on deregulation as a solution. A left-wing person might say, I say that we should give some support to stay-at-home parents. A left-wing person might disagree with that. A cultural conservative might think it's absolutely essential. There's just a lot you can disagree about in politics. Mm-hmm. But the premise of that disagreement would be that we agree that we should be doing something to financially support child rearing. Right. And then we're having a conversation about how do we do that. And then we can have, I don't know if you guys know the book, great classic business book, Getting to Yes, about how to have constructive negotiations, right? Yeah. And it's if we want to reach a solution, then I think we can. I don't think the values that divide Americans are this unbridgeable void, but they're significant. And mostly the way our politics is set up, politicians don't want to bridge the divide, right? They want to find reasons to break up and then say, F you. And so like we can't solve any problems that way, and we're not going to. And if you're satisfied with the country just kind of going down the tubes, that's fine. But it seems bad to me.
We had the Cold War, and that was the unifying thing. It was like what fueled the space race and other types of projections of American cultural values around the world. And we've basically lost it. This is like the Fukuyama like end of history kind of thing. Like we haven't really had anything like that to unify us since 1990 or so. And it sounds like your argument is, well, this is a thing that we can all aspire to. And so if we can agree on the ends, then we can start debating the means, which is where actual policy discussions take place.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And if you read Fukuyama's book, which people sometimes dunk on without having read, his last chapter is actually quite pessimistic. Like, he's not saying this is going to be great. He's actually predicting that we're going to have very divisive politics dominated by demagogues and nonsense, which I think is more or less what has happened. And as everybody says, like, history is not in fact over. We have a bunch of big challenges. And, something that I think is interesting about the Cold War is it wasn't just, well, okay, we did the space program to stick it to the Soviets, but that at that time, you would not have had an advocate of the free enterprise system stand up and say, well, you know what? If millions of people have stagnating wages for a generation and can't get health insurance and their children are living in poverty, that's just the market for you, right? Because that would sound like a pitch for communism, right? People who believed in capitalism wanted to make the system work, right? They undertook an obligation to not just say that, like, in theory, this would be better, but that, like, actually it had to be better. Right. We accepted that challenge, and we sort of don't have that now. Right. There's no sense that America needs to live up to its values or that America needs to deliver for its people. And I think that time, that moment of innocence is sort of slipping away. And it's time to start thinking about, what do we plan to do in this world?
Okay. I'm fairly sympathetic, though the idea that 1 billion Americans could be a similar rallying call that we can all unify around, like the space race. I mean, it just seems like we let more people in and we have more children. That's not like a defeat communism, go to the moon, plant an American flag. It seems
be number one forever.
Being number one, okay, being number one forever. There we go. Okay, yeah, that's controversial in its own way. But if I'm going to live in a country, I probably would want it to be the world leader. I don't know. I'm not nearly as embarrassed about that as I should be, but you're saying that.
I'm saying you should own it. It's like, I think one of the weirdest things in American politics today is like, nobody is like, who cares? Number one, number two. Everybody says, everyone's speech is like, this is the greatest country on earth. But then you look at these IMF projections, it's like, well, in purchasing power parity terms, we're already number two. In exchange rate terms, we're still number one, but everyone thinks China's exchange rate is fake. So maybe we'll still be number one for like 5 or 6 more years. And so, like, is that Joe Biden's platform? He's going to be like the last president for whom America was the number one economy in the world. That sounds really bad, actually, when you state it that way. So what are we going to do about it, right? Like, I say, grow the population.
Ross, I was going to say, like, I mean, when I visit like other westernized countries that have like, roughly similar cultural values to what we have here in the US, and if I go to a store, a grocery store, or I turn on the TV or whatever, everything that I'm seeing are cultural exports from the United States. And I can imagine being a citizen of one of those countries and just being like a little bit annoyed and jealous and envious that everything like runs through America.
Dude, you have no idea, Paul, how many times people will say like, "Oh, Ross from Friends," and I'm like, I'm not even like I'm just some random country I've been to all the time. Yeah.
Right. So that to me seems like a good reason. Like, I mean, I agree with Matt's objective here. I like being in the country that is the cultural exporter, because that means that when I participate in the culture, I'm participating in the thing that ultimately affects much more around the world than if I were just a Kiwi in New Zealand and my only export is Flight of the Conchords.
Yes.
Yeah, and what we do in the shadows and Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings. No, I mean, look, it says something. Look, everybody knows, right? If you grew up in New Zealand and you're smart and you're ambitious and, you know, you do really well in high school and whatever, and you want to like make it in the world, you know, you got to end up moving to London or New York or San Francisco or something like that. It's not going to happen in Auckland, right? And that's an important part of the American identity, I think, that like we are this great hub of stuff, right? Cultural stuff, technical innovation. We've got all kinds of problems. Obviously, everybody knows all about that. But we also have the opportunity for a level of greatness that does not exist elsewhere, right? And like maybe closer to the main theme of you guys' show, right? It's like, I have no idea where the person who invents a amazing way to like suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere will be born. Like, it could be anywhere. But I have a really strong odds that that company that does that stuff will be an American company. You know, like that person is going to come. Now, maybe not, right? You could imagine it, China, Japan, Germany. There's like a few other plausible contenders, but they're also pretty big countries in the scheme of things. And now, like, it could totally be a person from Iceland or, you know, Honduras or God knows where, but they're going to migrate to a big country with big cities, a big base of investors and technically skilled people and customers and a government that can think in terms of big projects, because just like that's how the state of the art moves forward. And nothing against New Zealand or Portugal or the Czech Republic, or there's lots of nice little countries out there, you know, and every once in a while they give us something like Legos out of Denmark, but like the big stuff gets done by the big countries. And that's like deep in America's DNA and fiber. And I don't think we should like reject that and like shrink ourselves down. I think we should embrace it.
One of the long-running debates on this show, although we've mostly had people who think the answer is yes, and I believe you will think this as well, people listening should have kids, right? If they're like, I don't know, because of the climate, you're saying just have kids. Your kid might solve climate change.
Yeah, I mean, there's that. And there's, I mean, look, if you don't want to have kids, don't have kids, right? And if you want to come up with a high-minded reason for it, you can say climate change is the reason. I mean, that's fine. I just like, I mean, I was a philosophy major in college, and I don't really go deep into this population ethics stuff, but it's like everybody understands that like Thanos is the villain in the Avengers movies.
I'm not sure that everyone does, but yes.
Okay, well, I mean, who knows? I got some weird callers from like Marin County, and that really made me wonder. But like, just not having there be people is not a solution to problems. Like you're just like, you're looking through the telescope in the wrong direction.
It's like the Tacitus, the Romans, create a wasteland and call it peace. It's like, there's no problem if there's no humans, but yeah.
So it's like, yeah, okay. Like, I mean, if you don't want to have children, you don't want to have children. Like, that's fine. I have one kid. I'm very happy with that. I feel like 2 would be very stressful. But like, I'm not going to tell you that I did that for other people. You know what I mean? It just makes my life easier to have a small family. There's one viewpoint that is like, well, people are the solution because, you know, like who might invent like the next great, I don't know, a solar panel that works at night or something. But it's just more than that. Is that like people are the topic of the discussion. So to just say like, well, if we didn't have any people, then we wouldn't have the problem. Like, that's weird. That's neither here nor there. And, you know, like someday one of these like nutty spree killers who pop up every once in a while and do something horrifying will write in their manifesto that like they're really worried about climate change. And then conservatives are going to all go dunk on the left about it. And that's going to be shitty and unfair. But like, it's shitty and unfair because like nobody actually thinks that just like extirpating humanity is a fix, quote unquote, to environmental problems. And so it's been a perverse, you know, I have gotten some reviews by people on the left who are like, oh man, like this is really terrible on climate grounds. But none of the people on the left who say that seem to actually disagree with me that we should have a generous immigration policy or that we should spend money on preschool and we should have paid parental leave. So it's a little like, where's the beef here? Like there was this old school, like real dystopian thread in the environmental movement where they were like all tied in with population control people and anti-immigration people. But they decided like 20 or 30 years ago that that was racist and bad and wrong. And they're right. But then like they need to own that. And you can't just like opportunistically invoke climate change.
So we had your colleague David Roberts on once upon a time, and I don't think he would mind me saying this. I will think about it before and edit it if I need to, but got a lot of nasty notes about it because we tried so hard to be like, David, surely there's something worth saving, right of center. There's conservative ideas that have some value. There are things happening with Republicans and climate. There are things to hope for. He was very nice, but gave very little ground on that point, Matt. So is there anything you'd like to add as an addendum to David's visit?
So look, I mean, on one level, I think I agree with his perspective, which is that the institutional Republican Party is not just sitting there waiting for a more reasonable climate proposal. And then they'll say, hey, yeah, like, let's do a bipartisan climate bill. Like, the reason they don't want to do that is more fundamental. That being said, like, I think, I mean, again, I look at Los Angeles, I look at New York City, you know, like, you look at places where Republicans are not a factor. And you ask yourself, like, are these guys doing what it really takes to address climate change? And they're not, you know, they're tied up in NIMBYism and like degrowth stuff and not really contributing in a meaningful way. And it just goes to show that like the problem is bigger and more complex than the Republicans are bad. Right. What I think is true is that, so say in 2016, Republicans had lost the election and lost control of the Senate, and Democrats had filled Scalia's seat with Merrick Garland, and then Kennedy had gotten bored. And, you know, say like the past 4 years had gone really differently. That might have made Republican Party elites really sad about losing. And they would have said, man, we should stop losing elections. It seems like our climate denialism is really unpopular. So maybe we should come to the table with some climate solutions. And there's plenty of right of center people who have reasonable climate solution ideas, just like waiting there for Republicans to say they want them, right? They don't want them is the problem. And so if you beat them badly and make them sad, they might go use those solutions. You know, just like anybody else, right? So it's like when Democrats lost enough elections in a row, they decided they were tired of everybody thinking they had no ideas on crime. And so they came up with some ideas, right? Like if Republicans lose, they'll come up with ideas on the environment. They're smart people. They're not evil people even. It's just that like right now, they think their current posture is a winning strategy. You know, so I say climate change. They say, oh, you want to ban hamburgers. So I don't know, like that's dumb. That's a juvenile approach to politics, but that's where we're at right now. But the solution isn't that there's going to be some utopia. Like conservative politics, right, is basically you have the interests of businessmen and you have the sort of sociocultural majority saying it likes its way of doing things. And that is the most natural form of politics in the world, right? Like everywhere on the planet, there is conservative politics for that reason. What exactly its content is changes all the time. So it's like conservatism will always be with us. And if you have solutions, like in Germany, they have some good climate policies because the Conservative Party like wanted to do them. And that's how things happen. It's like leftists, it's like, you know, we say things and we have ideas and we might win elections sometimes, but like things happen because conservatives get on board.
No, I actually agree with that. I think it is fair to say that in general, politicians are opportunistic. They seek out power above all else. And that if there were a complete and total drubbing of the Republican Party in 2016, I do think that there is potentially some truth to the idea that maybe they would start adopting positions that were more popular among the electorate that does not currently support Republicans. I think that's fair and legitimate. Yeah, I don't have much to disagree with there. I will also second that there are lots of people who are trying to engage with conservatives and Republicans on issues of climate change. I mean, Benji Backer has been on the show multiple times now, talking about that, and there, Bob Inglis as well. There are plenty of groups like that. So I think it's just a matter of time before eventually these things become so widespread. I mean, like culturally, and I thought you distinguished between these things pretty well earlier, Matt, that culturally, like climate change is an issue that everyone is aware of. More and more people are in support of doing something about, and it's just politics that is lagging behind. And there's no way that that doesn't catch up. So I think we can be optimistic about that for the future. It's just a matter of how do we make that happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah. And I mean, the problem with climate change, unfortunately, is that the timeline on which really bad things start happening is just pretty aggressive. You know, I mean, so it's like Obama, like to quote Martin Luther King about how the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, right? Mm-hmm. And so, in the 1880s, like Reconstruction is completely undone. And then it takes 80 years after that to get to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And of course, that's not like the end of racism or racial problems, but it's a huge step forward. Mm-hmm. But that 80-year timeline, that's awful, for the people who lived under Jim Crow for 2 and 3 generations. Right. And the good news is that we can now like big picture it. And it's like, well, we'll look back from the year 2374 and say like, maybe that wasn't so long. But if, irreparable harms are already underway, so it's like natural for activists to just be impatient. And I never want to tell anyone to like, hey, calm down. The problem's not so bad. At the same time, like the political process is what it is. And if, say, 2016, because it seems like 3 presidential election losses in a row is kind of like a magic number, at which point a political party starts seriously rethinking things. But it's not like, on the one hand, like I'm optimistic. It's not like no right of center people have good ideas on climate change, or that it's impossible to imagine a conservative movement that embraces meaningful climate action. It's just that, like, it's not going to happen like just for no reason, or because I write like a really good take about bipartisan solutions. It's like there has to be an electoral event that makes the people who are leaders in that movement say, the like gun nuts and the anti-abortion fanatics. And like, they need to say, man, I don't want to lose elections over this like coal mining nonsense. Like, who cares? And that's how coalition politics works, right? Like people get thrown under the bus. The people who didn't want to see like gay couples get married, like who knows what happened to them, right? Like Republicans put them in the deep freezer someplace because that became an embarrassing issue.
It's sort of counterintuitive to think, but like, I mean, if you are a conservative or Republican and you don't like the Green New Deal, then you have to engage on the issue, because if you're not even participating in that conversation, then there's no bulwark against that. And it's just going to be continued like one-sided policy discussion.
Right. I mean, and I would love to see a more pro-growth, technology-focused, but serious, not like, oh, we'll solve it with technology, so we don't need to do this regulation. Mm-hmm. But like, here's my 300 billion huge moonshot techno utopia. Like, do something, like something big. And then we can have a debate about that. But right now it's like, well, you have a couple big ideas rolling through environmental circles. And then you've got, I don't know what, you've got like, let's pretend that windmills are going to make birds extinct. And, That's dumb. There's just like a lot of dumb stuff in politics.
Yeah, I mean, government is really good at some things and it's really bad at doing other things. And I think we would all benefit if there were more diversified voices discussing like how to actually achieve these goals. Like I would so much rather have the government spend its resources investing in research and development of technologies and grant programs for things like converting to regenerative agriculture or whatever. I would rather not see the government create a jobs, like a make work program that's intended to solve like some social problem at the same time as curing environmentalism. And that's just like not a discussion that anyone is open to having right now. But it sounds like you are, and I wish more people were like that.
So electoral politics, right, is zero sum. Like only one person can be president. Only one person can win a House seat. But policy is positive sum. You know what I mean? Like if you have a serious conversation where one person says, my top priority is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and somebody else says, my top priority is to have a vibrant farm economy. Like there are ways to reconcile those two things if people state their top priorities and then they want to reconcile them. And that's true for like any two priorities, right? It's like human beings are smart and we can make win-win deals on pretty much any topic. But you have to want to make a deal, right? You have to accept the premise that we should be doing something on the climate front rather than using the issue opportunistically to win votes. And we just haven't been there. You know what I mean? Like we haven't been in a place where elected officials, but I mean, on climate, elected officials on the right in particular have not wanted to reach a deal. They've just construed a deal on a climate bill would be a win for the left.
Right.
That was a lot of fun. Thanks for coming out and hanging with us, Matt.
Thank you.
And yeah, one last question. I'll make it a short one, though. What are the odds that we get to 1 billion Americans this century?
I don't know. The odds are against it, but I don't think it's wildly implausible. We would need to achieve something like Canada's population growth rate. So, if enough people buy the book, politicians are going to be like, hey, I guess people want 1 billion Americans. I guess I should read it, and then we'll get it done. So it's really on you, the podcast listening audience, to decide whether or not it happens. I can't predict my own sales.
Wow, you are a professional. That was so skillfully executed. Where should someone buy this if they want to support what you're up to?
Well, I mean, it depends. If you are a sort of neo-pastoralist, you should buy it at your local independent bookstore. You can go to bookshop.com and order it from them. And that's great. We love independent bookstores in the book game. On the other hand, if you are a techno-modernist, you might think an ebook is a lot more environmentally friendly. And we're available in the Google Play Store, Amazon Kindle, whatever Apple's bookstore is called. I think just Apple Books. So it's everywhere. Also, audiobook. If you just love my voice so much, I actually read the audiobook script, so you can hear me ramble even more on Audible and other platforms. So there's really a lot of great ways to buy this book. There's no wrong way to do it.
Okay, link is in the show notes. Oh, go ahead, Paul. What was that?
I was just saying, I can vouch for the audiobook. I listened to it in one go while I was driving home from California a couple weeks ago. So
there you go.
Yeah, it's a good listen.
There's also a factual error about the population of Detroit in the text, which is corrected in the audiobook. So,
excellent. Real-time updates.
You can get less fake news about the population of Detroit by reading by consuming it in audio.
Great. Well, thanks again, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for all for being on this one. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. It is these days. The reviewing really helps get this content out to more people. Thanks so much for listening. Tell your friends, and we appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for listening. If you like the show, please rate and review it in Apple Podcasts and or Stitcher. It really helps us a lot to get this content to a wider audience. If you think what we're doing is useful, interesting, fun, hopefully all three, we'd certainly appreciate your rating and review. You can keep up with Nori at nori.com, where there is a newsletter. That's nori.com/subscribe. There's podcasts. There's a whole bunch else. Or you can send us an email at podcast@nori.com. We are also now on Patreon at patreon.com/NoriPodcasts if you'd like more content, engagement, and community. And thank you so much for your support.